here. I brought half the garden in to show you as well.
Brilliant. I'm trying to work out what you have. So I see dahlias, I see a little bit of salvia, and what else have you there?
I've got salvias, dahlias, I've got the best plant of the moment, geraniums, which are fab. I've got lots of little annual plants that I'll talk about in a bit. And I've got a bit of everything. I basically went out and pulled what was looking good in pots outside, just to bring them in and talk about them, and a couple of oddities too. I was up in Mount Venus Nursery, which is outside of Dublin, and he has lots of specialities. So I've got a bit of everything, basically.
So everything from the Mount Venus, where they have quite unusual and rare plants, don't they? And then down to something for the beginner. So we're going to try and cover everything, yeah?
Absolutely, yeah. So you said, I'm a self-confessed plant nut. I absolutely love them, but I also, want to get people encouraged and get them out in the garden and get them appreciative of plants, because we've had the strangest spring we've had in, well, a lifetime, really, haven't we? And there have been so many, tell us about it. But there's so many people interested in their gardens like never before. And for the couple of months that we were quite literally, because as gardeners, we were stuck at home, a lot of people rediscovered their gardens, and a lot of people realized that they have these outdoor spaces, which they'd never looked at before. And now, because they can't go away on holidays abroad, this, that, and the other, they have just spent a lot of time, money, and effort on the gardens. And we're basically going to give them all an idea of what to do, and a couple of really nice, simple plants to grow to give you plenty of joy for the rest of the summer.
Okay, so start me off. I've a lovely plot cleared, took everything out, have it all ready to go. What do I want to put in it?
A number of different things you can do there. If you want a really, really, really simple garden that doesn't take too much effort at all, take off the sod of grass you have in your garden. Next spring, go into the garden centres and buy packets of wildflower seeds and summer flower seeds. You get these mixed packets, and you basically turn over the sod, prepare the soil as if you're putting down grass, sprinkle these wildflower seeds, summer flower seeds on, and then for 3 to 4 months at the end of the season, you will have nothing but this array of colours of all sorts of different types and sizes, and you won't have to do anything. That's the beauty of a wildflower patch or these summer flower mixes. They're just so easy to do. You just put them down and forget about them, and you get this amazing garden without even having to lift a finger hard.
And then the frost kills them all off, and then I start again the following year?
Yeah, so the frost kills them off, then you start again. But hopefully at that stage, after seeing all these beautiful flowers in your garden, you might have kind of, got bitten a little by the bug, and then you want to start filling it. And when I fill a garden with plants, I have this, well, I don't have this thing with colour, because as far as I'm concerned, and there's so many designers and different people involved in this whole seminar, and I'm going to just go against the grain and say, colour doesn't matter, put whatever colours you want together. I better hide. But no, colour is just fantastic. And I have no problem in the garden putting every colour together. I love the cottage garden style of planting, where you just put different things together, styles of plants and textures and colours and everything, mush them together, and there's no hard and fast rules. Nature doesn't do these rules. Yes, we have colour palettes, and we have things that, if you want to have a very stylish and sophisticated garden, you want to maybe stay with a couple of colours. But in all honesty, if you look at nature, see what they do there. Colours come and plants come in all shapes and sizes, and they grow beside each other, and it's absolutely gorgeous. So I have no issue putting anything together. So that dahlia, I would have no problem combining it with this, what's it called, coreopsis here. Look at those two colours. Talk about colour clashing. But I have no issue at all in doing that. And then this red salvia, I'd knock that into the mix. The blue salvia here, everything. Just put it all together. And when you're going and deciding that you want to put all these colourful plants together, there is a small bit of, I suppose, thinking to do, and you have to be a little bit logical about it. So number one, you want your garden to be of interest for as much of the year as possible. There's a few different ways of doing that. So something like that dahlia, it's fantastic. But you are only going to get, maybe the end of the summer out of it. So from usually July, so where we are now, and it'll keep flowering right until October, which is brilliant, because most plants, if you get a month out of them, you're doing well. Dahlias, you get great value, you get a couple of months out of them. But you have to think, a garden is a place I want to enjoy all year round. So start off early in the season with your spring bulbs, put in snowdrops and daffodils and crocus and tulips and all of those gorgeous things. And that will get you going right from January all the way through into May, even, a lot of those plants. And then you can start looking at all the plants that will fill in later on in the season. A brilliant plant for a garden, for a new gardener, is this. I'll just put it onto the screen. It's geranium roseanne. And you see the way it's a bit of a mess there on the screen. It's kind of going everywhere. It's fantastic because what it does is it covers all the gaps in the garden. So when you put in these plants, like the dahlia, like this coreopsis, they kind of clump in the garden. And then you have these geraniums, which will fill in all the gaps and basically cut down on the weeding, because that's the other thing with gardening. I don't like weeding. I'm not a huge fan of it, and not many people are. But I also have this very relaxed attitude.
The geraniums, you're saying they're for beginner gardeners, but they're not geraniums we would know with the red, that smell of geraniums. That's a different geranium that you have there.
A very good point. And you'll have to stop me once or twice, because I'll go open one and not realize that people don't know what this is. This is a hardy geranium. So the geraniums that you buy in the shopping center or the garden centers, they're technically not geraniums, but we're not going to get into that. Basically, this is a hardy geranium. They usually come in blues and pinks and whites. And they are the most fantastic ground cover plant. They flower for months and months and months. They spread around the ground and they cut out weeds. So they're a great filler plant. And that's the great joy of gardening. You know, as I said, bring your bulbs in, have lots of spring interest, then put in your filler plants for early in the season. Lots of plants do flower, like hellebores and granny's bonnets, aquilegia. And then look at your summer plants like the phloxes, which you'll see in my garden in a bit, and the dahlias and salvias and all these other plants that will just flower continually for the entire season. And basically, you'll have a garden that's flowering from, I mean, you can have a garden that's in flower for 12 months of the year, but you'll have probably 9 months where it's just wow. And that's what I do at my garden. For 9 months, it's spectacular. For 3 months, it's a bit, you know, you could take it or leave it. But it's those 9 months that you really enjoy that.
And this open pot that we all have at the moment, and we're trying to get height into it, and do you think we should plant some greenery in it? When I started gardening about 20 years ago, didn't want any greenery at all. I wanted all, you know, annuals nearly. I didn't realise the beginner's mistake, you know, that it needed to have interest or whatever. Still haven't mastered it, by the way.
Well, no, nobody has. I haven't. I'm learning every single day, and that's the beauty of gardening. It's such a vast and, you know, unexplored subject. There's so much to learn, and every day I learn a new plant or pick up something I haven't seen before, and it's great. But you're right. You kind of have to think, what style of garden do I want? Do I want a mad garden like this with all these different colours? Or would I prefer a cooler, calmer look with a bit of, no. But there are people, and lots of people that would prefer that style.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, you have to go into the garden centre with that kind of thing in mind. And they're great in garden centres. They really know their stuff. And a great tip that I learned during lockdown from the Instagram post that I've been doing with Dermot is somebody said, go into the garden centre every month of the year. And every month of the year, buy a plant that tickles your fancy at that particular time. And that way, you'll always have a plant in your garden that's looking good. Now, that's not foolproof. The garden centres will push plants forward and back and what have you. But it's a very good tip for somebody starting off and they don't know what they want. Go in and pick the things that you like. And obviously, you have to be mindful of where you are. If you have a balcony, you don't want a huge tree. If you've got a smallish garden, you don't want a shrub or two that's going to take over and only flower once and then, you know, look green for the rest of the year and maybe not give you much interest. But it's a great tip to start off. Go in, pick out a few plants you like and work from there, because there are no hard and fast rules. Yes, if you like greenery, there's lots of lovely, you know, you can get clip box and topiary and yew and bay trees and all these things that look great and give you, like, these cool shapes as well. You can, you know, put plants into whatever shape you want. But if you want to go down the whole colourful route, yeah, go in there too and pick out what you like.
You mentioned about spring bulbs, but we kind of need to be thinking about them shortly, don't we?
Yeah, and that's the reason that I mentioned them, because actually a lot of the catalogues have been sending out their lists already for this coming season. And it's very exciting because, well, this kind of harks back to my plant obsession and the fact that I should be doing this job and not the interior design job. I must get onto one of your interior designers, because in my house last year, I was meant to fit a new bathroom. But I was ill for a little time last Christmas, and the money that was meant to go on fitting the new bathroom, I decided in a rage one night on the internet to spend on bulbs. So I went all out and I spent quite a substantial sum of money on bulbs for the garden. Spring bulbs, that you buy them in the autumn time, you plant them in, you know, late autumn, early spring, and they flower in the springtime. So tulips, daffodils, crocus. I went mad. The garden looks absolutely brilliant, but the toilet still leaks and the shower is a bit, you know, dodgy, but that doesn't matter.
Tulips are something that I don't ever seem to get to come back very well for me.
Yeah, so tulips are one that you have to be mindful of. If you've got a very light, free-draining soil, and the way you'll know that is if you go out into the garden on Christmas Day, the middle of winter, and if you have kind of squelchy underneath your feet and it's kind of soggy, your soil isn't very free draining, it holds onto water, it's probably quite clay, not great drainage. That type of soil, when you plant tulip bulbs in them, the first year they'll come up beautifully, they'll flower, but they won't come back. They just dislike sitting in wet soil like that. Where I garden down in my parents' garden in County Carlow, it's actually very, very nice, loose, sandy soil. And as a result, the tulips will come back year after year, but they're never as good as the first year, because when they're forced in Holland, they have them growing in these kind of fields. They're pumping them full of fertilizer to make them as big as they possibly can for the first year flowering after they're sold. And after that, they dwindle a bit, and they eventually will kind of come back after a couple of years. But I always treat tulips nearly like annual plants that you nearly discard after the end of the season. And I know it seems hard to do and you have to spend a bit of money on them, but the show you get from tulips and the amount of time they can be in flower for is incredible. So tulips are the one plant that you have to be careful of and don't expect them to come back year on year. But the daffodils will come back without fail. The snowdrops without fail, the crocus, and all of them will be for sale very, very soon. I'd say by probably the end of this month now, you know, early August into September, they'll come into the garden centres. Lots of online sources too. If you want a little more unusual, you can buy them from different places all over Europe. And I really would advise you to go look at a bulb catalogue, spend a bit of time, pick out a few things you like, because the joy that you will get from spring bulbs early in the season, when everything else is looking a bit drab, it's just fantastic and it's well worth a bit of effort.
I look at my garden and then I look at your garden. And even though we might have the same plants, they look very different. Mine might have one or two token flowers and you're bursting with flowers. Why is that?
Any garden, it comes down to a couple of different things. Number one, you have to be lucky and unlucky with where you live. So not every plant will do as well for me as it will for you, because we live in different parts of Ireland. It's not only that though, the main and the most important thing in any garden is the soil. And you have to invest a little extra time and effort into the soil when you're preparing a new bed. So as I mentioned earlier on, the wildflower, the summer flower mixes, you don't need to do very much for them. But when you start to plant the garden up with all of these wonderful dahlias and geraniums and phlox and all the different amazing plants, if you put a little bit of effort into preparing the soil and feeding that soil as you go, you will be reaped 10 times over in the flowers and what you'll get from them. There's different products as well that you can get that will actually activate the bacteria in the soil. But the best thing you can put is just good old farmyard manure, going back to that old staple. And I know, you know, people live in cities and towns, but you can now buy it bagged in the garden centre. And as you're planting, if you add that to the soil, it really bulks up the soil, gives it a feed, and you will be rewarded 10 times over. I'm lucky where I live, I've got an endless supply of it. And every year it goes out, and that's why the garden looks so great. Hey,
do you recommend feeding the soil every year?
Ideally, yes, but realistically, I mean, I would say that, but in my own garden, I don't do that. Every 3 to 4 years is probably more realistic, and it's when you'll actually get the time to do it. Every time you kind of go out to the garden and do a big job on how you feed your soil then. But every year, if you've got maybe some of these bloodfish and bone chicken manure pellets are great, and now you can get seaweed pellets. Seaweed feed is brilliant. Seaweed has so many nutrients in it. A fantastic thing. So if you have a look for all those products, you can give everything an extra boost. Feeding plants as well, you give lots of really fresh growth, susceptible to being knocked over in the wind, susceptible to pests and diseases. So the more you feed the plant, the more you'll have to look after it too. So it's not all good.
I have fed my plant, the soil, it's ready for my plants. It's now almost August. What am I going to put in? In
August, you can't fail with dahlias. And another thing that we've kind of mentioned about here, you know, touched upon, it's very topical, are plants for pollinators. So our pollinators, you know, everyone is now into wildlife gardening. It's a very topical thing for very good reasons, because our pollinators are really going down in numbers. And when you're picking plants, always try to keep them in mind. So this dahlia here, what's the name of this one? Called Temptation Purple. And do you see the way that that flower is kind of doubled up and doubled up and doubled up and doubled up? So yeah, that's a man-made hybrid. And actually, for pollinators, that's not so great. But this dahlia, one called Temptation Creamy White, is a much more open flower. And you see the way in the middle of that, it's much more like a child would draw a flower. And in there is where the pollen is. And that's exactly what a bee wants. So when you're picking flowers that you want the bees and all the pollinators to go to, pick open flowers like this. Don't pick these really doubly flowers and the ones that are really man-made, because they're not quite as good. So that's a great thing to start with. Dahlias will give you interest from now until the end of the season. Lots of the salvias will continue to give you interest. You can also start sowing things in the greenhouse for next year. So things like foxgloves, they're coming into seed now. If you plant them, they will start to come up, and next season you'll get flower out of them. So yeah, it's a matter of looking in the garden centre, seeing what's good, and yeah, get things that will flower for the rest of the season. And you can't fail with dahlias, because if you keep deadheading these, they will flower and flower and flower and flower and flower until the first toss.
You mentioned foxgloves, and you said plant the seeds now and they'll flower next year. So tell me about annuals, biannuals, perennials. I'm confused.
Yeah, so that's a very good point. This is a tray of marigolds, French marigolds or tagettes, and they are an annual. And an annual is basically a plant that completes its life cycle in a single season. So earlier on in the season, this little plant was a seed. It grew up from a seed. It's now flowering. It will seed again. And after the end of this year, this plant will be gone. And that's it. It's not coming back. That's an annual plant. A foxglove is a biennial, and bi meaning two, so it's a second year flowering plant. It will grow 1 year and it will flower the next year. Things like foxgloves, lots of other plants, forget-me-nots and wallflowers, things like that will all flower in the second season. Then you have herbaceous perennials, and the best example of that is my old friend, the geranium, which I have here. That is a herbaceous perennial, and it will come back. Perennial meaning it will return every single year. So it will grow in the springtime, put on all of this luxurious growth, it will put on all of these lovely flowers, but as soon as the frost comes, late in October, maybe early November, all of this foliage will die back, but the crown of the plant will remain alive, and as soon as it starts to heat up in the spring again, the ground, it will come back to life. And then you have your trees and your shrubs. So that's the kind of 3 or 4 main varieties of plants. So shrubs obviously being things like hydrangeas, and then you've got trees which vary from small trees for your small gardens like rowans to the mighty oak trees that we have in our hedgerows. So that's a very basic thing of all the different plants. So with annuals, another great example of an annual, and this is a great plant to combine with your bulbs. These are pansies, and you get pansies and violas. These are flowering quite early, but a lot of them flower well into the winter and even into the following spring. So if you plant a load of bulbs in a pot and then plant these on top, it'll give you a bit of interest. And on that point, I love to, when I'm planting up pots, not just do a pot and then put in one type of bulb. I like to put in what they call a bulb lasagna. So you put the bottom layer of bulbs into the pot. The biggest bulbs go into the bottom, something like a daffodil. On top, the slightly smaller bulb, and you put a little bit of soil between it. So maybe a daffodil will go next. Then a slightly smaller bulb again, something like maybe a crocus. Then a slightly smaller bulb again, a snowdrop. And that way, the flowers will come up season after season, and you will have a pot that's in flower, especially if you've only got a small space, for literally 4 months of the year. And then if you top off that pot in the or autumn time with something like winter flowering viola, they'll also flower right all through the winter. So that's a brilliant way if you've got a small place to put in lots of colour and lots of flower for a huge amount of time, depending on the varieties of bulbs you put in. And the more varieties you put in, the more you'll be rewarded. And when you're putting bulbs into pots, don't be mean. I know we always say we don't like having the bulbs touching when we're planting them in, but have them so close that they're nearly touching, but just don't quite have the bulbs touching. But more is more when you're planting up pots. So, you know, the more bulbs you can fit in there, the better. You'll have to feed it a bit more, you'll have to water it a bit more, but the results are just fantastic and well worth it.
Yeah, because they usually say, you know, 10 centimetres between bulbs, and it looks mean then, you know, where you see this lovely big clump and you're going, mine doesn't look like that.
Well, no, and I have a friend who has a great saying, and that saying is the plants haven't read the book. So, and I am a firm believer in that saying, and I will use it all the time. And when you're planting bulbs in pots, that's a great example of that saying. So the plant hasn't read the book. The plant in nature does not space itself out 10 centimetres. The plant will go where it sees fit. And if you have a really good compost in there that's got lots of feed in it, the plant won't mind because it will grow. And as long as you keep on top of the watering and the feeding, it will be fab. Brilliant.
I've one last question, which is a hard one. What is your favourite plant? If you could bring one plant to a desert island, what would it be? Ooh. Now, forget the conditions of the desert island.
I was going to say, well, you see a desert island now. You have so many cool plants like cactus and the agaves and all of the desert.
No, it's an island in Ireland then with no conditions. You can have a greenhouse if you want. One plant in your garden, what would it be?
It's like asking your parents what's their favourite child, and it changes every single day, I think is the answer. And I can never give you an answer. If you were to ask me this in the middle of March, I would say without doubt it's a daffodil. Because daffodils there's 27,000 different varieties of daffodils. So there's surely one that you'll like, even if you're not a huge fan of daffodils. At the moment, dahlias are the star at the moment, which is why I have them here, the salvias. All those really hot colors are looking fantastic. I love primulas in the springtime. They give you such great interest. I love any plant that sells seeds, some stuff like Aquilegia, because they always fill the gaps. And I have pictures of my garden as it was developing, and there was, you know, all these stone edges and that. Those stone edges have disappeared now because I let the plants seed, and I love plants that will fill all the gaps up. Things like Eryngium, I love Eryngium, which is a sea holly. If anybody lives by the seaside and wants a plant that will withstand quite a bit of wind and not get too tall, but Eryngium, one called Big Blue, there's lots of different types of Eryngiums, but they are just fantastic. So it's an impossible question to answer, Gwen.
We'll pop on to your Insta Lives if you want to tell us about them.
Yeah, so myself and Dermot Gavin, every night at 7 p.m, we go and we do an Insta Live called Garden Conversations, where we will answer all of your gardening questions. The one thing and the last piece of advice I would give to anybody who's trying new to gardening or wants to give it a go is just do that. Give it a go. Try the plant. If you see a plant that you like, you know what, just try it. Because the worst you can do is that plant will die. And if it happens, it happens. I kill plants all the time. Hands up, you know, it's what happens. It's how I learn. It's how I've learned so much about gardening. It's trial and error, more error than trial. And eventually, you know, you'll find what works in your garden and in your space, and you will have a great garden. So give it a go. What's the worst you can do?
Thank you, Paul, so much.
No worries, Gwen. Thank you.